The morning of June 8, 793 AD, began like countless others on the quiet island of Lindisfarne. As the first light of dawn spread across the North Sea, the monks followed the same peaceful routine they had practiced for generations. They gathered for prayer, tended to their gardens, copied sacred manuscripts by hand, and cared for a monastery that had become one of the most respected religious centers in all of Christian Europe. For more than 150 years, violence had never reached these shores. The monastery had no walls because none had ever been needed. It kept no soldiers because no enemy had ever appeared. To the people living there, the greatest concerns were the changing weather and the daily rhythm of worship. Then, everything changed in a matter of minutes. Small, dark shapes appeared on the horizon, growing larger with every stroke of dozens of synchronized oars. As the strange ships approached, their carved dragon heads and towering sails looked unlike anything the monks had ever seen. Before anyone understood what was happening, armed warriors stormed onto the beach with terrifying speed. Carrying axes, swords, and painted shields, they broke through the monastery doors without hesitation. Precious crosses were torn from the altar, silver chalices disappeared into leather sacks, and priceless manuscripts that had taken decades to create were tossed aside because only the jeweled covers held value to the attackers. Those who tried to resist had little chance against experienced fighters. By midday, the peaceful monastery had become a smoking ruin, and the mysterious raiders had already vanished back across the sea with their stolen treasure. News of the attack spread rapidly across Europe, leaving kings, priests, and ordinary people stunned. Many believed such a disaster could only be a sign of divine punishment, while others feared that an entirely new kind of enemy had appeared without warning. Yet, the most frightening realization was not the destruction itself, but the fact that nobody knew who these warriors were or where they would strike next. But this devastating raid was only the first chapter of a much larger story. The warriors who attacked Lindisfarne did not come from a mighty empire filled with grand cities and enormous armies. They came from the rugged coastlines of Scandinavia, where survival was often a daily struggle against nature itself. Long winters, rocky landscapes, and short growing seasons made farming difficult, leaving many families with barely enough food to survive. Land was one of the most valuable possessions a person could own, yet it was usually inherited by the eldest son, leaving younger brothers with little hope of building prosperous lives of their own. For ambitious young men seeking wealth, status, or even the chance to start a family, staying home often meant living in poverty forever. Instead of accepting that fate, they turned toward the sea. Over generations, Scandinavian shipbuilders perfected one of history's greatest technological achievements, the Viking longship. These sleek vessels were incredibly fast, capable of crossing open oceans despite their narrow design, yet shallow enough to sail far up rivers where larger ships could never travel. They could even be carried over land by small groups of men, allowing Viking crews to move between waterways and appear where no one expected them. This extraordinary mobility gave them an advantage unlike anything Europe had ever encountered. At the same time, stories of wealthy monasteries and divided kingdoms across the North Sea began spreading through Scandinavian ports. England seemed almost too tempting to ignore. Rich churches displayed gold, silver, and ornate religious treasures with virtually no protection, while rival Anglo-Saxon kings spent more time fighting each other than guarding their own coastlines. To Viking leaders, these lands represented opportunity rather than danger. What began as small expeditions driven by survival and ambition soon evolved into carefully planned voyages organized by experienced chieftains eager to claim wealth and glory. The attack on Lindisfarne was never a random act of violence. It was a calculated test designed to measure England's defenses, and the ease with which it succeeded convinced countless others that even greater rewards lay waiting across the sea. And once that weakness became clear, the raids grew larger, bolder, and far more dangerous. At first, Many people in England believed the attacks were nothing more than isolated raids carried out by desperate pirates searching for easy riches. The Vikings would appear without warning during the warmer months, strike a monastery or coastal village, gather everything of value, and disappear back across the North Sea before local forces could organize a response. It was a terrifying pattern, but one that English rulers assumed they could eventually manage. They were wrong. With every successful expedition, the Vikings gained something far more valuable than gold. They gained knowledge. They learned the geography of England's rivers, identified the weakest coastal settlements, and discovered that the kingdoms defending the island were deeply divided by rivalry and distrust. There was no united England capable of responding as one nation. Instead, separate kingdoms such as Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex often viewed each other as competitors rather than allies. While one kingdom suffered an attack, its neighbors frequently focused on their own political struggles instead of preparing for the next invasion. The Vikings quickly recognized this weakness and exploited it with remarkable precision. Their longships allowed them to sail far inland through rivers that many believed were impossible for invading fleets to navigate. Suddenly, towns located dozens of miles from the coast found themselves under attack without any warning at all. Places once considered perfectly safe became vulnerable overnight. As the years passed, the raids grew larger. Fleets that had once consisted of only a few ships expanded into dozens, carrying hundreds of experienced warriors. Entire trading centers were burned, valuable ports were looted, and fear spread throughout the countryside. Then, something even more alarming began to happen. Instead of returning home when winter arrived, Viking forces started remaining on English soil. They built fortified camps, stored supplies, gathered intelligence, and waited for spring. This was a dramatic change in strategy. They were no longer interested in quick raids alone. They were studying the land, testing the resolve of local rulers, and preparing for something much bigger. To many English leaders, these still looked like increasingly dangerous raids, but in reality, they were rehearsals for a full-scale conquest that would soon transform the history of Britain forever. And when that invasion finally arrived, it brought an army unlike anything England had ever faced. In the autumn of 865 AD, everything changed. The fleets arriving on England's eastern shores were no longer small bands of opportunistic raiders searching for treasure. They carried what later became known as the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Viking warriors gathered from across Scandinavia with a single purpose: to conquer rather than simply steal. Thousands of experienced fighters landed together, bringing horses, supplies, weapons, and enough resources to remain in England for as long as necessary. Their campaign began with remarkable patience. Instead of immediately attacking East Anglia, they negotiated with its rulers, receiving food, shelter, and horses in exchange for temporary peace. But this agreement was never intended to last. It simply allowed the Vikings to strengthen their position before striking their true targets. Their first major objective was Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by a bitter civil war between rival claimants to the throne. As the two English factions focused on fighting each other, the Vikings marched straight into York, one of the most important cities in northern England. The divided defenders were unable to organize an effective resistance, and the city fell with astonishing speed. Soon afterward, Northumbria itself collapsed. The pattern repeated across the country. East Anglia, which had once supplied the invaders, attempted to resist but was defeated, and its king met a brutal end. Mercia, another powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom, gradually lost city after city until its ruler abandoned the country altogether. Within only a few years, kingdoms that had taken generations to build were dismantled one after another. By 871 AD, nearly all of England north of Wessex had either fallen under Viking control or ceased to exist as independent kingdoms. Churches were destroyed or transformed into Viking halls. Local nobles were forced to swear loyalty to new rulers, and entire regions came under Scandinavian authority. It seemed as though nothing could stop the conquest. Only one kingdom remained unconquered, ruled by a young and inexperienced king who had inherited a desperate situation. Few believed he could survive, let alone reverse the course of history. Yet it was this unlikely ruler who would soon become the greatest obstacle the Vikings had ever faced. When Alfred became king of Wessex, almost no one believed he could stop the Viking advance. He was young, relatively inexperienced in warfare, and inherited a kingdom already on the brink of collapse. The Vikings had crushed nearly every major Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and their victories had created an overwhelming sense that England's fate had already been decided. Alfred fought battle after battle, sometimes winning small victories, but often suffering painful defeats. He understood that every loss brought the enemy closer to complete domination. Still, he refused to surrender. The greatest crisis came during the winter of 878 AD, when the Vikings launched a surprise attack on the royal stronghold at Chippenham during the Christmas season. Many of Alfred's warriors had returned home for the holidays, leaving his defenses dangerously weakened. The assault was swift and devastating. Wessex seemed to collapse almost overnight, forcing Alfred to flee with only a handful of loyal followers into the marshlands of Somerset. Hidden among swamps, reeds, and narrow waterways, he lived as a fugitive, while much of his kingdom fell under Viking control. To many observers, it appeared that the last independent Saxon kingdom had finally reached its end. Yet Alfred saw the marshes not as a prison, but as an opportunity. From his hidden refuge, he secretly sent messengers throughout Wessex, calling on every free man who still believed England was worth fighting for. It was an enormous gamble, because he had no certainty that anyone would answer his call. Weeks later, something extraordinary happened. Farmers, craftsmen, local nobles, and experienced warriors emerged from towns and villages across the kingdom, gathering at Egbert's Stone to stand beside their king once again. This rebuilt army marched toward the Vikings and met them at the Battle of Edington. The fighting was fierce and lasted throughout the day, but by nightfall, the Viking army had been driven back into a fortified camp. After enduring weeks under siege, they finally surrendered. Alfred's victory did far more than save Wessex. It proved that the seemingly unstoppable Viking advance could be halted. Rather than celebrating and returning to old habits, Alfred transformed his kingdom. He built fortified towns, known as burhs, reorganized the military so soldiers could defend, while others farmed, and even developed one of England's first effective naval forces to challenge Viking ships before they reached the coast. These reforms laid the foundation for England's future survival and eventually earned Alfred a title no other English monarch would ever share: Alfred the Great. But although the war had changed direction, peace was still a long way off, and much of England remained under Viking rule. Following Alfred's victory, England was divided into two very different worlds. The treaty that ended the immediate conflict established a boundary separating Alfred's kingdom from the vast territories controlled by the Vikings. This region became known as the Danelaw, stretching across much of northern and eastern England. Although the fighting had slowed, the story was far from over. Instead of existing as temporary occupiers, many Vikings chose to settle permanently. They built farms, established villages, traded with local communities, and raised families on English soil. Over time, what had begun as an invasion slowly evolved into a remarkable cultural transformation. Scandinavian settlers introduced their own customs, laws, languages, and traditions, while also adapting to life among the Anglo-Saxon population. Markets became places where Old Norse and Old English speakers exchanged not only goods, but also ideas and vocabulary. Many of the everyday English words still used today, including sky, window, knife, husband, law, egg, and wrong, entered the language through this period of close contact between the two cultures. Place names ending in by, thorp, and toft still reveal where Viking communities once flourished centuries ago. Marriage between Scandinavian settlers and local English families became increasingly common, blending traditions that had once seemed impossible to reconcile. Even religion gradually changed. Many Vikings, who had originally worshipped the Norse gods, eventually accepted Christianity, building churches in towns they had once attacked as raiders. Archaeological discoveries in places such as York, once known by its Viking name Jorvik, reveal thriving communities filled with craftsmen, merchants, blacksmiths, and traders connected to networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Yet beneath this growing cooperation remained an uneasy reality. Neither side had forgotten the devastating wars that had divided the island, and both understood that the fragile peace could easily collapse if either gained enough strength to challenge the other. In the south, Alfred's successors were already preparing for exactly that moment. They believed England should once again become a single kingdom, and they intended to reclaim every piece of land that had fallen under Viking control. The struggle for England was entering a new phase, one that would be led not only by kings, but by one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. Alfred the Great passed away in 899 AD, but the vision he had fought so hard to preserve did not die with him. Instead, it became the mission of the next generation. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited not only the throne of Wessex, but also the determination to reclaim every piece of England that remained under Viking control. Unlike the desperate defensive campaigns of his father's reign, Edward's strategy was carefully planned and relentlessly methodical. Rather than launching reckless invasions, he strengthened existing fortifications, built new defensive towns, and slowly expanded his territory, one stronghold at a time. Every captured fortress became another stepping stone deeper into the Danelaw, steadily tightening the pressure on Viking rulers who had once believed their victories were permanent. But Edward was not fighting this campaign alone. Standing beside him was one of the most extraordinary figures of the early Middle Ages, his sister Ethelfled, known to history as the Lady of the Mercians. After the death of her husband, many expected her to retreat into the background, as was customary for noblewomen of the time. Instead, she assumed command of Mercia and proved herself to be a brilliant military leader. She oversaw the construction of powerful defensive burghs, organized campaigns against Viking-held towns, and personally directed operations that reclaimed key territories across central England. Contemporary chronicles praised her leadership alongside that of kings, an extraordinary honor in an age when military command was almost exclusively reserved for men. Together, Edward and Ethelfled slowly dismantled the Viking grip on England. Some Scandinavian leaders chose to fight, while others recognized the shifting balance of power and surrendered peacefully, accepting Anglo-Saxon rule rather than risking total destruction. One by one, towns that had remained under Viking control for decades returned to English hands. The decisive moment arrived in 927 AD, when Alfred's grandson, King Aethelstan, marched into York, the symbolic heart of Viking power in England. Unlike many of the brutal battles that had defined the previous century, the city was secured without a major fight, marking the first time that a single ruler governed all of England. Ironically, it was the Viking invasions themselves that had made this achievement possible. Before their arrival, the land had been divided into competing kingdoms that rarely cooperated. The constant threat from Scandinavia forced those separate realms to unite under one crown, creating the foundations of the English nation. Yet victory did not bring lasting peace. Across the North Sea, ambitious Scandinavian kings still viewed England as a wealthy prize worth claiming. Within a few decades, a new generation of Viking armies would return, stronger, better organized, and determined not merely to raid England, but to rule it once again. The final chapters of the Viking Age would prove to be every bit as dramatic as its explosive beginning. For nearly half a century after England had been reunited, many believed the age of Viking invasions had finally come to an end. A new generation grew up without witnessing the terror of dragon-headed ships appearing along the coastline, and the kingdom enjoyed a period of relative stability. But that confidence would prove dangerously premature. Beginning in the late 10th century, powerful Scandinavian kings launched fresh invasions, unlike the scattered raids of earlier centuries. These were well-funded military expeditions supported by established kingdoms in Denmark and Norway, commanded by rulers whose ambition extended far beyond plunder. England's rulers struggled to respond effectively. Instead of confronting the invaders on the battlefield, enormous sums of silver were paid in an attempt to persuade them to leave. These payments, known as Danegeld, temporarily delayed conflict, but ultimately encouraged even larger invasions, convincing Viking leaders that England was both wealthy and vulnerable. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1002 when King Ethelred ordered the killing of many Danish settlers living throughout England, a decision that ignited outrage across Scandinavia and paved the way for full-scale retaliation. Within little more than a decade, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard conquered England, and after his death, his son Cnut inherited the throne. Surprisingly, Cnut did not rule as a foreign conqueror. He embraced English customs, supported the church, governed with remarkable skill, and eventually became one of the most respected monarchs in English history. Yet the final act of the Viking Age was still to come. In 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada launched one last ambitious attempt to seize the English crown. Leading a fleet of around 300 ships and thousands of warriors, he landed in northern England, expecting another successful conquest. Instead, he encountered King Harald Godwinson, who marched his exhausted army nearly 200 miles in only a few days to confront the invaders before they were fully prepared. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Viking army suffered a crushing defeat. Harald Hardrada was killed, and the once feared invasion force was almost completely destroyed. Of the hundreds of ships that had carried the army to England, only a small fraction returned home. Historians often regard this battle as the true end of the Viking Age, but history had one final twist waiting. Only days after this hard-fought victory, Harald received devastating news that another claimant to the English throne had landed on the southern coast. William, Duke of Normandy, forced the exhausted English king to march hundreds of miles once again before meeting him at the Battle of Hastings. There, Harald was killed, Anglo-Saxon rule came to an end, and Norman England began. The Vikings had disappeared as conquerors, but their legacy remained woven into England forever. They reshaped its language, transformed its politics, influenced its laws, and, perhaps most importantly, helped forge the United Kingdom that would eventually become one of the world's most influential nations. The age of the Vikings had ended, but the world they helped create was only just beginning.